The 1830s is a decade in American history that gives us a preview of what is coming next. In this image that you see here, an illustration by Udo J. Kepler from 1895, you can see Uncle Sam dreaming of conquest. You look at the images, you can see Uncle Sam trying to take control of islands in the Pacific as well as in the Caribbean. This is around the time of the Spanish and American War. It also shows Uncle Sam giving ultimatums to different people, looking west with weapons. And the point of this is the United States is looking at ways to have influence, power, and control over territories. This is mostly showing Uncle Sam abroad, but there is also something happening here in the United States regarding this issue. And this is what I am going to talk about today in this lecture. The idea of American exceptionalism. This is a map of the British colonies in 1750. This is where the population lived. And in 1763, the British signed something called a Proclamation of 1763, in which they stated that they would reserve the land west of the Appalachian Mountains to Native American people. These mountains divide the 13 colonies from the rest of what would become the United States. However, American independence violates this idea, and this gives birth to the idea of American exceptionalism, giving white, male, wealthy landowners and slave-owning people a sense of land entitlement. This is the birth of what would then become manifest destiny. The idea that Euro-American people have the right to take over land, even if this land is already being occupied or there's people already living there. And the reason why they have the right over these people is because they are not Christian, they're not European, and just like Christopher Columbus and the last of discovery, they have more rights than these other people. This results in population growth and a push of indigenous populations farther into the west, conflict with the French, eventually a purchase that is done between the French and the United States of what we know as the Louisiana Territory, conflict with the Spanish, and later on conflict with Mexico. It's important to keep in mind that early on, colonists also were land speculators, meaning that they explored territories that were not yet part of the United States, had already been in the Ohio Valley, and later on, even when the United States is not all the way to California, there has been already people exploring these territories without permission. So land speculation is something that goes back all the way from the beginning, and one of the most important people in United States history, George Washington himself, was a land speculator. American exceptionalism results in positive things for many Euro-Americans. Of course, these people have to pay the price of learning how to survive in the frontier. They have to learn how to defend themselves or deal with Native people who are defending themselves in their homelands. And through much sacrifice in some of the stories of these people, they're able to be successful. On the other token, the effects of all of this success are not so much success for minoritized people who are already living here, such as Native Americans, Mexican American people, who end up losing land, African American people who continue to be enslaved, Native people who experience violence all the way until the end of the 1800s through something that we know as the Indian Wars, in many cases massacres by the United States Armed Forces. Native people and Mexican American people suffer discrimination, and they find ways to cope with this situation and adopt through assimilation, but yet many are marginalized. It's important to cover two topics here specifically. One is the journey to Texas independence, because that story is very complex and it has a lot to do with these ideas. The other topic that needs to be covered in this lecture is the topic of gold discovery and Indian removal in the 1830s. So let's get into that. What you're looking at here is a map of the United States, or a map of what the United States will become in the year of 1830. You have the orange color that marks the states of the United States. At this point, Arkansas, Florida, and Michigan are territories. There is the green color, dark green color, that represents the Louisiana Purchase. And then there's a lighter color that represents a piece of land that is disputed between Mexico and the United States. Then you have the Oregon Territory that at this time is disputed between the British and the United States. And you have the territories that are Mexico. Mexico gains independence in 1821. Also in that year, Mexico continues a previous agreement that was made between Tejanos and Anglo settlers that were invited to come into Texas. Mexico was concerned that if they did not have a population presence in these territories, they would lose these territories, or they would never have any type of growth in these territories. So in 1821, Mexico continues a colonization project that was started by the Spanish and invites and facilitates the settlement of territories in Texas by Anglo people from the United States. Something similar happens in California in the late 1830s into the 1840s to prevent the same thing that I just mentioned. People in Texas and later on in California to settle in Mexican Texas and later on in Alta California. They had to have good moral character. They had to profess the Roman Catholic religion. If they were not this religion, they had an opportunity to convert to this religion. They had to agree to abide by Mexican law. They had to swear loyalty to Mexico and its people and respect the culture and assimilate. That meant learning how to speak and read and write in Spanish, and eventually acculturate to the people of Texas. The first people that were invited into Texas were Moses Austin, who passed away around 1821. So his son, Stephen Austin, continues this agreement with the Mexican government. He brings a total of 300 families from the United States that are Catholic. These families also bring slaves with them because slavery is allowed at this point in Mexico. Not just allowed, but also there is incentives for people that bring slaves. And there is incentives for people from the United States to come and settle in Texas. The incentives that existed in this place at this time, again, we're talking about the 1820s, specifically 1821, 1822, is that if you brought slaves, you would be able to acquire additional land per each slave that you bring. As an American colonist, you wouldn't have to pay taxes for 7 years, and you would be able to acquire land at rather cheap prices. Here I have an example how much land was in Texas as compared to other parts of the United States. So 10 cents per acre in Texas, well, where in other territories that were at this point part of the United States, you would have to pay $1.25 per acre. And then if you, as a foreigner, marry a Mexican citizen, you could be eligible for extra land. This would be showing that you were going to assimilate and become part of the Texas experience. There were also rules on where to settle, and the rules required for these colonists to settle near Mexican population areas where there was already Mexican settlements. However, many of these colonists that came in later did not settle close to Mexican populations. They settled in East Texas, Northeast Texas, away from Mexican people. Two of the most influential people in Texas at this time would be Jose Antonio Navarro and Juan Seguin, who were part of the supporters of inviting Anglos to settle in Texas. Eventually, these two acculturated or assimilated somewhat to American culture. Jose Antonio Navarro, for example, was known to have adopted a plantation and bought slaves. Juan Seguin assimilated to the point that he was no longer calling himself Juan, he called himself John Seguin. These colonists came mainly from Louisiana, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, and Mississippi, bringing with them ideas from the South. In many cases, some ideas included white supremacy, slavery, amongst others. In 1827 in Texas, there were about 5,000 Tejanos. This is Mexican, people from Mexican heritage. And by that time, you already have 12,000 Texians. And by Texians, I mean Anglo-Americans or Euro-Americans who had become Mexican citizens, but as you can see, the numbers are not even for every Tejano. In 1827, there are a little bit more than 2 Anglos. By 1835, the numbers are 4-1, almost 5-1. So in a place like Mexican Texas, where Spanish was mainly spoken, Mexican culture was celebrated, and the Catholic religion was practiced, eventually things changed little by little. At the end, Mexico failed to integrate and assimilate Anglos into its culture, even though it tried its best to control this predicament by passing legislation in Mexico City to control this situation. In 1829, Mexico passes the equivalent to the Emancipation Proclamation, ending slavery. This is by the first black Mexican president by the name of Vicente Guerrero. He would be the second president of Mexico. And then in 1830, Mexico passes laws to stop Euro-American immigration into Texas. However, this is not fully enforced because it's really hard to enforce, and Anglos continue to come in to Texas illegally, if you will. By 1833, the Mexican government forces people in Texas to go to Saltillo in Coahuila, south of Texas, to do a business. And the Mexican government combines Texas and Saltillo into one state. And the capital of this territory is in Saltillo. And that way, Anglo-Americans who are in Texas get to see the Mexican population and get reminded that they're in Mexico. In 1834, Mexico is dealing with issues, not just in Texas, but other parts of the country, like San Luis Potosí, Yucatan, Jalisco, amongst other places in the country that are not in a good, stable political situation. The government decides to be a lot stronger and centralize the power in Mexico City. People in Texas do not like that. They like a lot of local control, independence, democracy, and all of that. And because they did not like the fact that Mexico was questioning already the idea of slavery, which they found a way to continue to practice slavery after 1829. They felt threatened, and they began meeting and calling for state conventions without the permission of the Mexican government, and eventually provoking Mexico into a conflict. This conflict is known as the Texas Revolution, where from February 26 to March 6 of 1836, the Mexican army and 200 plus Texians and some Tejanos fight against each other at an old mission called San Antonio de Valero, where Antonio Lopez de Santana is able to crash the rebels, but eventually the Mexican army goes to rest near a river called San Jacinto, and at this river where they're resting, Sam Houston and his troops come and capture Antonio Lopez de Santana. They torture and kill many Mexican soldiers in less than 10 minutes. It's important that when you learn this history, you learn the details of this history, And you have to understand also that the Mexican army, even though had greater numbers, many of the people in the Mexican army were not well trained or equipped for this type of scrimmages or battles against people that were very well trained and had good weapons that had long range. So sometimes it's not about the numbers, it's about the training and the equipment that you have. Eventually, in 1836, Antonio Lopez de Santana is forced to sign Texas independence. And according to the people of Texas, they're an independent nation. But in Mexico City, this is not recognized until the time when the U.S. and Mexico go to war. So because to the people of Texas, Texas is already its own nation state, they eventually joined the United States as a state on December 29, 1845. And this is going to lead to the next things that happen in this war, which is a reaction by Mexico, where they moved troops to the new or the disputed area that is the border, and the United States right away sends troops to Texas to protect this new acquired territory. This will lead to the U.S.-Mexican War, where Mexico loses and recognizes finally Texas and loses the rest of the now southwest of the United States. And this is an example of where Mexico tried to assimilate Anglos, but they failed. Another situation in which you have similar things playing out is the issue of Indian removal. This is a quote from President Andrew Jackson regarding the removal of Native American people. If you take a minute and read this quote, you may want to pause this video at this point and read the quote. You will notice that President Andrew Jackson speaks to the Native people as if he's a friend of theirs and almost apologizes to them for having to remove them. And in a way, he's telling them that he is doing it to protect them. So, just like other people in the past, Native Americans find a way to themselves to the system that they are not much different than the colonists or the settlers that are coming in by adopting civilized ways. So I gotta talk about 5 tribes that are known as the 5 civilized tribes which avoided removal. These tribes tried their best to assimilate to American culture, religion, and values so that they could protect themselves from a possible removal. How did they do that? They adopted farming as a lifestyle when they were not always a farming people. They wrote and adopted a constitution like the United States Constitution. They adopted Christianity. They began to receive formal education. In some cases, they had their own language, newspaper, and some of these also adopted the idea of slavery and established their own plantations. This is applicable in different degrees to different tribes, but there is 5 tribes that adopted this, and I will get into that in a second. How do we get to Indian removal? In 1828, Georgia discovers gold in Cherokee land, Cherokee territories. So by 1830, U.S. President Andrew Jackson, with the support of the U.S. Congress, signs into law something called Indian Removal Act of 1830. And eventually the people known as the Cherokee of Georgia get removed into Oklahoma. You may know this as the Trail of Tears. And this is a famous image that you have probably seen before in high school and other U.S. history courses. But it's important to note that it wasn't just that Cherokee that got removed, but the rest of these tribes that are known as the 5 civilized tribes. That includes the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and of course, like I mentioned, the Cherokee that you are familiar with. This causes the deaths of many people, the starvation of many people, and historical trauma that we are still witnessing today with the Native American nations. This is a map of the original Cherokee land claims, and then it shows you the differences into the Cherokee, the way that the Cherokee ended up by the 1830s. Okay, something similar happens to the Dakota people and to all tribes. They end up keeping, in some cases, a very small portion of their traditional territories. This is the story of many people. The Trail of Tears is not a story that is unique to the Cherokee. It's the story of, I would say, the majority of Native American tribes in the United States. For example, the people that live in Pala, close to home, are originally from a place called Warner Springs, and they were forced to move from Warner Springs to what is today Pala. And that is the case for many of these tribes in San Diego County, who were once occupying territories near the beach, the mountains, and the deserts, and eventually they ended up with a small reservation somewhere between the desert and the mountains. So in this lecture, the conclusion is that there are 2 events, and of course there's more, that give us a preview of the next decades of American history. The acquisition of more Native and Mexican land and the continuation of the slave system will result in a war against Mexico, a civil war in the 1860s, and a continuous war against Native nations over land until the end of the 19th century. Race relations involving Euro-Americans, American Indians, African Americans, Mexican Americans are in one way or another connected to this decade of American history. And today, we are still experiencing the results of this decade. Thank you, and I will see you, or you will hear me in the next lecture.